Yesterday, they said that when we were preparing for this conference, the situation was completely different. When I sent my first abstracts, the last sentence was, in current Armenia, one should not have high expectations about rapid change. And then the change came about 2 weeks ago. A new abstract has to be penned down a few days ago, but the main change, the main difference was one. I had sent the first iteration to some like-minded historians in Armenia. They said you shouldn't just diagnose, you should identify a way out. But we all in the diaspora will immediately be blamed of being armchair theoreticians, but they told me it's new Armenia, people are more willing to listen. I hope it's right. Regardless of the inflated expectations that we have in this country, historiography is a very slow process, and if the Velvet Revolution made any change, it just brought us back to a discussion that has already been there for a while. Not everyone was supporting the ideas I'll just set forth, and not everyone will agree with my proposals or recommendations. This is what I like most, the quote. It's history is an endless debate. When I encounter post-Soviet Armenian intellectuals, they always tell us we shed ideological shackles. And the second thing they say, which is the official take of historiography, and it's even in the most recent textbooks, in independent Armenia, historiography progresses. This sounds very Soviet to me. When I was a student, everyone had it ingrained. This or that discipline progressed under the Soviets. I came up last year with a report of the most recent 2012 textbook. It is in the same spirit. If those who like that would not like what I have to say now, I'm a little more moderate now about the Armenian historiography having progressed since. If people don't feel their shackles, which is postmodernistic, the Armenian historiography is still in the stage of primordial nationalism. In cooperation with Archbishop Levon Zekian, I decided to translate it as primordial nationalism. They're still in the shackles thereof, and that permeates all the textbooks now. We used to have historic Armenia, which was much larger than what we used to think of it in the Soviet period. We had an Armenian nation which apparently is older than what we used to think during the Soviets. We're indigenous here, although this defies explanation. Basically, the Indo-European proto-language emerged in the Caucasus. Everyone left other than Armenians. They stayed put, and they've never mixed with any other non-Armenophone entities. Some, of course, some others merged with Armenians. No Armenian ever was assimilated by others. This is, in a nutshell, the axis or the essence of our most recent textbooks as well. We had almost continual statehood according to textbooks at least since 28th century BC all the way to Mongol period. Last year in Lebanon I heard an historian who said that the foundations of our statehood date back 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. He was, by Armenian standards, a serious scholar. So basically, our statehood is older than Urd, and it was decorated a historian with big titles, not run of the mill. So, this is the general atmosphere in which the rest of the construct is built. Nationalism was the dominant force in historiography all the way through the 19th century. The Soviet power adjusted to it, although Marxism is more of a constructivist discipline. But even in the Soviet textbooks, there was a very powerful primordialism present throughout, and it's forcefully come back to Armenian historiography. But the problem is that elsewhere in the world is no longer dominant. And this is where the current primordialists have encounter a problem. For example, Manandyan and Adons in their time, or even Balasanyan before them, never encountered. So, quite naturally, there is also something else in Armenia. Every issue is immediately politicized. I believe this is already Soviet legacy, starting with Stalin and continued on in the name of Lenin when Stalin was no longer fashionable to quote. This also provides possibility. This is partially explained by the struggle with Azerbaijan, Turkey, to some extent Georgia, where primordialism is also rampant, and eventually why these theories are no longer acceptable in the West, and this is official because there is a lot of conspiracy guided from abroad. When this first emerged 20 years ago, the first target was diaspora historians. Now it expanded, it's the Eurasia Foundation, it's Soros, and the target is even expanded onto some Armenian living. You need a psychologist to analyze this. How could people believe in something non existent so fundamentally? This is beyond the scope of professional historical analysis. People high ranking in the academy still believe in writing and things like this. The second issue is that this is not the only problem. Last year, when I spoke about the 2012 university textbook, the emphasis was on ideology and content, whereas now I will speak more about the methodology. If we look today at the Armenian historiographic product, what makes it different from the Western or Northern American historiographic product? The Armenian historiography assigns more place to political history on the expense of socioeconomic history. Even in the Soviet period, the proportion was more logical, whereas now it's seriously slanted towards political history on the expense of the socioeconomic. And political history, first and foremost, is the history of military political elite, especially if you cover that in a university textbook. You completely miss the lower strata, especially those who revolted against the regime in the most recent textbook. They are completely lacking. So in the history of Armenian nation, there were no popular movements if we believe the textbook. So I already referred to the prevailing role of the Armenian. It looks as though there were no other faiths in the Armenian history. The Armenian Catholics are 10% of the global Armenians. They don't even have a percent, 1% in the textbook. There is no even explanation of how they came about. There is absolutely no gender issue, which was lacking under the Soviets as well. They didn't add it, notwithstanding that in Western textbooks it's mainstreamed everywhere. The textbooks that I used, some when they refer to gender, they only understand it as man-woman relations. There are some textbooks that may go beyond, but not all of them. For example, the one that I'm using is more inclined, doesn't reflect on non-binary relations at all. There are some that do, of course. In the event of Armenia, when you look at the abstracts of the dissertations that were defended, there is a line, Soviet rudiment. They have to mention what methodology used. In the Soviets, it had to be Marxism-Leninism. Now they all claim it's historicism or historism. But even that is used in a very controversial manner. In the new academic 8-volume history, it says that Hachatur Abovian belonged to the school of historicism. It's problematic first half of the 19th century. It more belongs, the term itself more belongs to the second, third quarter of the 19th century. As for the new methodologies, they seem to be non-existent as a result. New ways of posing questions is absent. Mostly they pose political agenda questions. So how do we get this science from its current parochial insular state? How do we enrich Armenian historiography with current international historiographical discourse? This is for an ethnic Armenian living outside of Armenia a preoccupation whose parents have taught me there is this country of Armenia that you must love out there. That's where everything hinges. My late mother and father took their decision to implant this in me. From the day when I left university and went to London, I've been seeing that there are many things out there that we still don't teach in Armenia. And for me, that's always been a matter of concern and will remain so. What changes in the wake of the Velvet Revolution? The leftist liberals have come to power. How long they will stay there remains to be seen, but there is this drive to change things. These two deputy ministers perfectly fitted in this pattern who spoke today. So those groups which already had existed in Armenia outside of this mainstream, shall they become more active or shall they be able to become more effective? Is one of the next challenges we have to see. In this general context, here is my alternative proposition comparing the current curriculum with the one that I studied in the same university in between 86-91. Here's the problems I detect. I'm glad now that the Armenian language is now a discipline in its own right. It wasn't there when I was studying. But I think we should emphasize more essay writing rather than reading. The knowledge of European languages is very important, among others, for IT. I'm only talking theoretical and international literature. This doesn't cover regional languages. If you want to become an Orientalist or a specialist in classical languages, teaching these disciplines is very important because when you see people who go beyond Armenia to pursue their studies, mostly they're either graduates of the Romance and Germanic Department of Yerevan State or Brusov. I haven't seen anyone abroad who's been a graduate of the History Department continuing the studies. There are some archaeologists in Germany, but I didn't have any significant contacts with them. It's very important to encourage in the new educational system for old school historians who were writing political history to establish links with interdisciplinary links with economists, with sociologists, with anthropologists. There is a serious lack thereof because their questions do not have enough space. The new textbook should assign more place to socioeconomic history, culturology, gender, issues study in history should be encouraged. They don't exist as we speak. There should be more place to the development of methodology and theory of history. You should expose people, and this is a little radical, which the American universities don't have, but in the event of Armenia, I think it's necessary, at least in the MA track, if not before, different genres of historiography, because they allow to think differently. What do you understand by genre, you may ask? For example, oral history, microhistory, cryometrics, or contrafactual history. All these are most important to stimulate the historian's brain and expand his horizons. And another radical recommendation: the university lecturers of Armenian history must at least teach also world history to maintain the connection with what's transpiring and look beyond Armenia in their studies. When I told someone, do you know whether this dispute of whether Urartu is Armenian or not is replicated in India, whether there was an infusion of external blood or not, they were surprised. They didn't know. So these comparative studies are very important to expand their mental horizon. This much about education. About management of universities. Of course, you should boost and enhance all types of international relations. In history, there are very few such links internationally. You should find various grants and access them. Let me be frank, Armenian historiographers are partially victims of the diaspora political activism. There's this mood prevailing in America: if Armenians were to know better about history, they will make more noises about diaspora. It will become more of a headache for the Armenian state. So if Armenians don't think about history, we're off the hook. Either you have to persuade Americans that that's not the case, and studying history is as important as international relations or environmental studies. And if it is truly impossible, well, to get those grants, you could only use Armenian homegrown resources in places where foreign grants are less feasible. Of course, new textbooks also are necessary, and there is a more important issue. Of course, you can still write textbooks, get a dozen good experts to bring their brains together and come up with an ideal textbook, but teachers to teach by those textbooks is a bigger headache. How do you get them? Eventually, by the end of the day, those textbooks should be multi-perspective. That is, if you're covering a political dispute, please give equal room to both points of opinion rather than telling the reader from scratch that these are the good guys, stay with them, oppose the other. The most innocent example: when we cover Arshak period, all our textbooks clearly nudge you to love the Parthians and hate the Romans, although our sources are Roman. And there are many more such examples that one may find. You have also to repeat frequently that whatever is in the textbook is not the ultimate truth. This is how they taught before, this is how they think now, so that the student can learn to think differently rather than taking it for granted. Critical thinking is missing in general a lot. Moreover, I've sometimes seen people the opposite. I can remember the Armenian Studies Center in the Yerevan state. There was an exposition there. They came with an exposition in Lebanon, and here's what they said: our website wasn't made interactive intentionally, so that when people peruse this website, they learn that this is reliable science generated by high-class specialists. This is Weltanschauung. Like I said in the beginning, I didn't play games of neutrality. I'm steadily entrenched in these issues. It's my profound belief that this is better and will help Armenia to gain more visibility in the academic discourse. This may even help tourism, frankly speaking, if people were to read more about Armenia, to compare it in international discourse, but of course it's difficult to persuade everyone at once. 2 years ago, during a similar discussion in Lebanon, I came up with this formula. Names are conventional. The dispute between the Westerners and traditional nationalists in our current reality is the survival. Similar to the 19th century struggle between Garapar and Ashkarabar, classical Armenian and modern Armenian. And there is a need to write its culturological history. Thank you.